Welcome everyone to church history. Let's open in prayer and then we'll get started with the lecture. Heavenly Father, we just thank you so much for today. Thank you for your presence in our lives. Thank you for wanting us to be a part of what you're doing with your kingdom, with your people, with this class. Lord, I just ask that you would be with each one who's here. I ask a special blessing on those who can't be here tonight for whatever reason it is that they can't be here. I pray that in these final weeks before the class closes, Lord, that you will give everyone stamina and endurance, that you would give them a spark and a joy as they learn more about you, learn more about your church, learn more about the history that you've put in place for us. We just ask you to be with us, be present with us tonight. And we just ask that you would continue to guide us and guard us and direct us in all we do. And we ask it through Christ's name. Amen. Okay. So whenever we finished up last week, we had just barely gotten to Vatican I. I just want to hit the couple of things that are important, or the things that I want you to remember. So this ecumenical council, lots and lots of things came out of it. Declarations and other things, just like the other councils that we've talked about. We just kind of hit on a couple of things that came out of it. So please don't limit this council to being just these two things, because more came out of it than just these two things. I'm just focusing on them. The first thing that came out of, now remember what led up to Vatican I. Remember there was the man who came in from Spain, and he the way that it's described in some of the more church viewed literature is it was an invasion into Rome, an invasion into Italy. It really wasn't an invasion. He was given the kingship. But whenever he went in to the city, he was making declarations and changing things such that the church was no longer either as effective or as vocal or as influential or whatever. He was just changing the balance of things. So Pope Pius, one of his reactions to that so-called invasion was the Vatican. Was the Vatican. It wasn't the building. It was Vatican I, this council. One of the things that came out of this was this idea of papal infallibility. I did some extra reading, just maybe half an hour or 45 minutes worth of reading today. And it's interesting because this idea of papal infallibility it's definitely a hot spot amongst non-Catholics, because it's an area that a non-Catholic, whether you're secular or Protestant or whatever, if you're just not Catholic, you hear the words papal infallibility, and it sort of raises heckles, and it makes people, it causes a reaction in people without even really knowing what is happening. It could be that the reaction is warranted, but this word infallibility just really, it does upset people. Whenever you read any sort of writings that are coming from the Catholic Church's perspective, they're equally upset. As it appears from what I was reading today. Again, what can you really learn about this much history in half an hour or 45 minutes? But what I found was that basically the Protestants in particular, I'm sure the secular community fits into this, but the Protestants in particular take this idea of papal infallibility and they make it a blanket absolute statement. Or we make it, I'm a Protestant, we make it a blanket absolute statement. Like the sentences or the things that you read regarding this will be along the lines of when the Pope speaks from the chair, which is this next thing we're going to talk about. When the Pope speaks ex cathedra, he cannot be questioned. He cannot be. You can't rub up against it. You can't change it. It is what it is. And that's true But from the Catholic perspective, when I was reading these other perspectives on papal infallibility, what they emphasize is when you're talking about the doctrines of the church, when you're talking about the theologies and the teachings that the church is responsible to relaying to its congregation or relaying to its people. So it's almost like it's to the Catholic Church, from what I've read, it's more of an authority issue. Whenever the head of the church is explaining doctrine, that's it, right? The Protestant churches just take a different stance on that. There is an authority, a hierarchy that's set up for sure, and the pastor or the teacher who is explaining whatever, the scripture or the doctrine, it is assumed and expected that it's correct, but most Protestant, or maybe not most, the ones that I have been taught under are quick to remind the congregation, it's my job to feed you as well as I can, but it's your job to make sure that I'm not saying something wrong. Like, you're not supposed to just take what I say. And that's the difference between, in general, just very generally speaking, the difference between the authority of the Catholic Church and the authority of, quote unquote, a Protestant church, right? There may be Protestant churches that take that stance. I don't know. But it's just interesting. When you say papal infallibility, it doesn't really matter who you say it to. They get upset. The Catholic Church, at least from what I could tell from what I read, is upset that they have been misunderstood and that the Protestants in particular are continuing to push this agenda that's saying the Pope is perfect, when that's not, from their perspective, what they're saying. Nobody is perfect. He's a man, right? He's just a man. So their take on it, I hope, since I've only read a little bit, is we're talking about doctrine, we're talking about the way the church is run, we're talking about how to feed the people, right? So, papal infallibility. When Pope Pius put it into effect, which is part of the reason that this is part of the reason that the Protestants take the stance that they do. Pope Pius was having a response to this, invasion into Rome, and his response to that is, I am the authority. The Church of Rome is the authority. It doesn't matter what nobility or government or whatever comes in, the church is the authority over everything. And so part of this statement is a reaction to changes that were happening. And remember, he told the people who were part of the church in Rome have nothing to do with the government. He didn't say revolt against them. He didn't say talk bad about them. He didn't say, he wasn't saying be aggressive against them, but he said have nothing to do with them because they are basically not recognizing the authority of the church, right? So this idea of papal infallibility came from Vatican I, and it apparently is still a bit of a hot spot even today. Ex cathedra, this it literally means from the chair, and it's an extension of papal infallibility. So papal infallibility, I have not read anything anywhere that says the Pope is right every time he speaks. That's not papal infallibility. What I have read is that the Pope is infallible when seated ex cathedra speaking about doctrine. Okay, so this is sort of a position of authority, and it is influential and important enough that it was actually written into the outcomes of Vatican I. There were some other things that came out of Vatican I that are, less, not necessarily less influential, but things that started out and then sort of fell off, and whatever. But papal infallibility is still something that is enforced, and this idea of ex cathedra is still enforced. So that's what I want you to know about Vatican I. The date, I'm not as worried about you remembering the date, but I'm still just trying to keep you in line along the timeline where we are in history, okay? Now at the time, so at this time, you've got over in France, you've got the French Revolution happening and all the craziness that goes with that. You've got a response to a change in authority in Rome and all that's going with that. And in England, you've got a couple of movements that still actually have lasting effects today, but a couple of movements. And again, this is going to sound like more of the same. We've had a couple of lectures where we've talked about the struggle that happens between the traditional church and the Protestant church or the Reformed church, right? Whether it's the church in Rome, the church in England, whatever. There's this, something happens and the people who grew up were brought up and raised up in this community or this church of tradition. Whenever the Reformation happens, some people embrace that Reformation and some people say, well, I agree with this, but we've got to keep the traditions of the church. Like this is who we are and what we exude, and we can't get rid of this. So, and it's happening again. In England, there was sort of a split. So remember, it kind of had already started. If you remember talking about the Quakers and the Congregationalists, the Quakers, after Queen Mary was no longer in power, because remember, she was crazy against the Protestants, and there was a lot of dispersion. There was a lot of martyrdom. That's Fox's Book of Martyrs is, concentrates around that time. And lots of dispersion, people fleeing persecution, fleeing persecution from the Church of Rome under Bloody Mary, so to speak. After Elizabeth came in, she was more tolerant. She was still Catholic, but she was more tolerant of the Protestants. And remember, the people started to move back in, and you had the Quakers that kind of came out of that group. The Quakers they were called Quakers in England, but they sort of migrated to the colonies. But remember, those were that was the group of people who said, oh, the Church of England, we just need to reform the Church of England. They sounded like Luther. We just need to get in there, ask some questions, reform the church and get it back on track, and then we're going to be good to go. That was their plan. The Congregationalists were a little more, or a little less positive or hopeful, and they said, Church of England can't be reformed. We're just going to split off and we're going to do our own thing, right? This is kind of still just an extension of that. It's not the Quakers and the Congregationalists. It's not that group, those groups of people, but you'll notice that the themes are so similar. So you had two groups of people. You had the Oxford movement and you had the Clapham community. All right, the Oxford movement is also known as the High Church. It's important to know High Church because if you do any reading, it is. I hear this referred to as the High Church more often than I hear it referred to as the Oxford movement. I don't know if that's because we're not in England, or maybe we're too far removed from the culture. I don't know, but it's knowing high and low. You do. And it just gets thrown in there like you know what they're talking about, Anyway, so the High Church. You do not need to know these names. I'm just giving you names. If you want to jot them down and do your own research, that's fine. But John Keble, John Henry Newman, and Edward Pusey, those were the three guys that sort of got this group of people together and formed the idea and the belief system behind it. They were definitely Church of England folk. They were heavily tied to tradition, but their emphasis was on the worship of God, which is fantastic. They had a heavy emphasis on the worship of God. But because they are traditionalists, you have to do it the way that we tell you to do it. There is a way to do it with reverence and with power. But if you start going off the rails, then you're going to start causing some problems. So heavily seated in tradition. And interestingly enough, if I remember correctly, John Henry Newman, he actually ended up leaving this movement and joining the Catholic Church at Rome. So whatever. Anyway, something happened with John, I think, but I don't know the story. I'm just sort of throwing it out there. If you're interested, you can find out if I am remembering correctly or not. Anyway, so this movement was basically saying, yes, let's worship God. Yes, let's get excited, but let's keep the traditions of the church, and let's not let our human sides or what we think is best take over. We need to stick with tradition. The Clapham community, or the Low Church, they really were not the opposite. They actually had a lot of the same ideas and belief systems. This man, William Wilberforce, I have some interesting things about him. He was completely against slavery. It was interesting. He was an abolitionist, and he realized that the slave trade that was happening at the time was extremely lucrative. And what was happening was there were certain maybe groups of people like tribes, or just groups of people that were living, they were all the same ethnicity for the most part, but they lived separate culturally. What they would do is, because it was, these are poor people, whenever they had an opportunity, they would kidnap people from other tribes or other communities, and they would sell them into the slave trade, and they would make a bunch of money. And so Wilberforce was totally appalled by the whole thing. He just thought it was terrible. And he was one of the first people, at least in England, to start petitioning the government and start going up and making this whole issue known to the government. And he was making speeches, and he was addressing Parliament, and he was trying to get the government to understand that the way in his opinion, the way to break the slave trade is to make the money less major. So it's not that you can't force slave traders to pay less for slaves, but what you can do is you can teach the people, you can educate the people, you can give them good jobs, you can give them value and worth beyond selling each other and making money that way. And so he was trying to address the government to say, look, we need to have some reform here so that people will just work and have self-worth and not be doing what they're doing. He also made his second speech that he made. He actually allowed women to participate. What? And help him spread the news. That was an unheard of thing at the time. So he was really kind of an edgy guy. The Emancipation Act, where the slaves were freed, he was alive when that happened. He was very excited, but he died 4 days after the Emancipation Act was signed in. So he really accomplished what he could. He accomplished, his mission, and a few days later he passed away. So he was pretty influential in that area. But anyway, the emphasis of this church was you must be born again. And in that, there was an emphasis on outreach. And you can tell by what he was so passionate about that outreach was important, because you didn't have tribes of people necessarily living in England selling each other. He's talking about foreign missions. He's talking about going to other countries where it's more rural and a little bit more difficult to control, right? So he left his homeland, went into these other places, saw what was happening, and was just saying, "This is not right. We need to get involved in this and get it taken care of." He put an emphasis on outreach locally as well, and he was saying, "Okay, what we need to do is help people, and we need to help people because we're Christians. That's what Christians do, is they help people, and it's not as a condition of helping them. Like we're not going to go out into the community and say, okay, I'll help you, I'll buy you some food, or I'll help you get a job, but in return you have to listen to what I have to say about Jesus." And so he was like, look, if you're a Christian, you should be helping people for the sake of helping people. That is what a heart of love does. You help people. And it is never a condition of, I'll only help you if you listen, or I'll only help you if you convert, that sort of stuff. And there was, during the Spanish Inquisition and some other things, there was some of that was happening, like you kind of sort of felt forced. I mean, sometimes it was for your life and sometimes it was for help or whatever. And he was trying to change that attitude. The Clapham community, this low church, is the seedbed of evangelicalism. Evangelical churches sort of came from this group of people and launched out as the group began to grow. All right, so that is what was happening in England. Now, we talked a little bit about the Great Awakening, and again, I'm going to emphasize to you that I think it's for the final, I don't know if it's the next test or if it's the final, I think it's the final, to know the different fathers, because I'm pretty sure I put that on the test. We're going to hear 5 or 6 or 7 different men who are the fathers of, so it's important for you to know those. We talked about George Whitefield last time. He's the father of modern mass evangelism. And when you think about what George Whitefield did, it totally makes sense why he has the title that he has. He went to all kinds of countries. He dispersed himself all over the world, spreading the gospel and spreading, you must be born again. And so this mass evangelism, that's what he did. He didn't stay in England. He went all over the place, stood outside to preach to people. And with the help of John Wesley, they really had an impact across the globe, really. Now, tonight we're going to talk about the Second Great Awakening. What I'm going to talk about now is kind of in between, okay? So the Great Awakening has happened. That's happening in the colonies. And in between the First and Second Great Awakening, you have a few people that are doing their thing from their own country. So this man, William Carey, he is known as the father of modern missions. When we get to the end of what he did, you'll understand why he was given that title. It may help you remember why he was given the title he was given. He was an Englishman. He was born in England. He was a Baptist. And he has a very interesting story. There is a famous quote. He is often misquoted, but there's this famous quote that people will say, William Carey said, "Expect great things and attempt great things." But that's a misquote. What he actually said was, expect great things from God and attempt great things for God. So it's interesting, in this period of secularization, where his words that were centered around God, the God part was removed, and what is remembered is just the expect great things and attempt great things. But he was definitely saying, he definitely said, expect great things from God and attempt great things for God. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about his life. This was in the late 1700s, so like 1780-ish, in that area. He was a very poor man. He married a woman named Dorothy Plackett, and she was from an exceptionally poor family. He worked as an apprentice to a shoemaker, and he was very, very bright. He was, by the time he was 12 years old, he had taught himself Latin, and he was working on Greek. So he just had a affinity for language. He is at work one day, and something happens, and he accepts Jesus. And his life begins to change after that. So now he's a Christian, he goes to a meeting, and the center part of what was being said at this meeting was foreign missions. It was a meeting about foreign missions. And in particular, they were talking about foreign missions going into India. Well, he was all excited, all fired up, and so he said, yeah, I'm going to go to India, right? So he signs up, and he pledges to go into the mission field into India. There was another man named John Thomas He was a surgeon. He was at the same meeting, and the two guys got together and said, "Yeah, we're going to do this thing. We're gonna get our families, pack them up, and we're going to head over to India, and we're gonna plant the mission field." So, William Carey's wife is pregnant, and they have 3 other kids. So it's a kind of a big family. And he goes home and he says, "Hey, we're gonna pack up and we're gonna go to India and we're gonna start this mission field and it's gonna be great." And she says, "Well, you may be going to India, but I'm not going to India. I'm staying right here. I'm not gonna go with you." And he says, "Well, I really wish you would." And she says, "No, I'm not going to go." And he says, "Well, I'm going to take our oldest son with us," thinking that it would entice her to go. And she goes, "Okay, you can have him. You guys go on to your mission field. I'm staying here in England." Well, he and John Thomas get on the boat and they start heading out. As they've started to sail out, the boat is actually called back because John Thomas has a tax debt that he has to pay, and he's not leaving the country till he pays that tax debt. So the boat turns around, brings him back in, and they disembark, and John goes and does his business, and he goes back home and he says, "Please come with me. Please come with me. It's a second chance. God is giving us a second chance to continue to remain a family. Just come with me to India." And she's like, Nope, not going to do it. Staying here." Well, then John Thomas comes back in, and he goes up to her and he says, "Look, if you don't come to India, you can almost hear it, out of the will of God, and you are going against what God has for your life and the life of your husband and all the people that we are going to be able to help. You're going to have to deal with that between you and God." And she's like, "Whoa!" It sounds just like what happened between Farrell and Calvin, right? "If you don't stay here and teach and preach, you're out of the will of God and you'll have to pay." And he's like, "Okay, I'll stay," right? So basically the same thing. Well, she hears this and she says, "All right, fine, we'll pack up and we'll go to India with you." So the whole family, so John's family as well as William's family, they all gather their business up, they get on a boat and they head out to India. Well, life in India is quite difficult. It is, I don't know how many of us have had an opportunity to do foreign missions. I have not had very many opportunities, but my understanding is it's very infrequent that the entity, the church, for example, that is sending you on this mission is going to pay for your plane ticket, your hotel room, all your food, the supplies you're going to need when you get there to help the people that need, like the painting and the nails and or the kids' stuff or, whatever. It's not an entity that's going to send that with you. Well, it was the same back then. It was a brilliant idea. Let's go and let's set the mission field. And they literally went with everything they had, which was very little. This was an extremely poor family. Went with what they had, and now what? So they get to India, and it's a different language, it's a different culture. He's got to figure out how to work and still take care of his kids, but his mission is the gospel. So he's got these 2 things that are super important that he's trying to keep up with, and it's very difficult. They have a very, very rough start. And his wife is not happy. His wife is not happy at all, right? Because she's basically been guilted or whatever into being there. It's not good. Yeah, it's not good. She told him no twice, and then things are not great. Well, during these first few months and years that he was there, he translated the Bible into 6 different Indian languages that included 29 dialects. It was amazing. He was so prolific, and he was still supporting his family somehow, right? Well, he actually contracted malaria at one time. I have not heard, obviously he survived it, but he contracted malaria, and his 5-year-old son ended up with dysentery, and he passed away. Well, when the boy died, his wife sort of had a mental break. She sort of lost it, and she began they started to have to lock her into a room, almost tie her down, but they had to lock her into a room to keep her in the house, because if she got out, she would go screaming up and down the streets, and she would accuse him of adultery, and she was just like, she just had a mental break, and she was not able to cope with where she was living, how unhappy she was, and then the loss of her son, or their son. So for 20 years, this is how William and his wife are existing and raising their children. All the while, he is translating and setting the mission field as best he can. Well, his wife Dorothy, she eventually gets sick and passes away. And we're not sure, but the writings that at least have been found that I've seen about her, I'm not sure that she ever converted. I think she was an unbeliever to her death, but I don't know. I don't know that that's really the case. It's not my place to say one way or another definitively. But after his wife dies, about 5 months later, he marries a local Christian girl, 5 months later. So she is the exact opposite of Dorothy. Not only is she a believer, but she's wealthy, she's very well educated, she's very refined, she's got resources, and it's just a very different sort of marriage. Their marriage was very happy, but it was surrounded in scandal because of the length of time between his wife's death and his remarriage. So there were all kinds of rumors going around about that. His second wife, her name was Charlotte. She ended up passing away. And 2 years after Charlotte died, he married another woman named Grace, and she was 17 years younger than him. So in his older years, he had a young person with him. She took care of him. She loved him. They had a strong marriage. And after he passed away, he left everything he had to his wife, but he was buried with his second wife, Charlotte. He spent 41 years in India. He left England and never returned. He spent 41 years of his life. And in that time frame, he is known to have converted about 700 people out of the millions that are there, which seems like not so successful. But to those 700 plus people, it was really successful. And he continued to translate and write and immerse himself in the culture and become part of the community. He was trusted, he was loved, and so by and large, it was, for going out on a mission field that was started at nothing, with nothing, he was very successful. The things that he's known about, or he's really known for, and the reason he's called the father of modern missions is because he set up a sort of outline or an ideal for how foreign missions should be approached. And not that everyone uses these, but it's a guideline. The 4 things that he said is, when you get to your mission field, you need to immerse yourself in the language and immerse yourself into the culture. If you don't know the language and you don't know the culture, you cannot speak. You can't speak equally with the people that you're trying to bring to Christ. He said that it should be a lifetime mission. It shouldn't be short term. If you're going to go into the mission field, go all in and stay in, which obviously he believed because he stayed for 41 years. He stayed for the rest of his life in the mission field. He said that, or he actually had one of the first ideas where you take different churches or different groups of people, and they come together in unity, working on a single mission. Instead of one church being in charge of one thing, he was bringing everyone who's interested in trying to be a part of it in, and they would work together. But they would stay within their separate groups, but they would work together toward the foreign mission, right? And he also said,
Sandy?
Yes.
What's that second word there? Formed what? No,
Societies. Formed societies where different churches worked toward the same ministries. The 4th thing he did was, he said, and this is obviously experiential, you need to bring people with you, volunteers, people who are willing to get there and stay there, and you need to bring your own funding and establish your own funding when you're there. You can't go into a mission field and expect the people who are not converted to support you. Okay, so those were the ideas that he set forth, and many foreign missions follow at least portions of these ideals. So he was extremely influential in the area of foreign missions. This David Livingstone, he was also a foreign mission. I don't know as much about him as I do about Carey, but he went on a missionary field to Africa, and so remember the way that the Spanish Inquisition was. There was a lot of just brought up attitudes that you go into a place and they either convert or you force them to convert. I mean, it was sort of a pushy situation, and sometimes it got violent. Not always, but sometimes it got violent. He was absolutely against that. He said, if you want somebody to respect what you have to say, you have to respect those people. You go in, you understand them, you learn about them, you understand their culture as much as you can, and you certainly don't do anything violent. You can't force people into loving Jesus. Like, you can't do that. It doesn't work. So he was, even though it sounds to us like a no-brainer, it wasn't necessarily something that was a no-brainer at the time that he was doing this. He was also staunchly against slavery. He also saw how the slave markets were trading, the tribes were trading each other or capturing and trading people from different tribes and making money for survival purposes. Let me be clear. These people were not trading other people so that they could have a big house and a fancy car and, a mistress on the side. These people were trying to feed their families. They were trying to keep their crops planted and whatever. They were trying to survive. And they were just using non-family. They were keeping their family close and finding whatever outside to try to make their money. So he was staunchly against slavery. He worked very hard to break that. And he also realized that if you want to stop the slave trade, you've got to figure out how to equip the people so they can make money on their own. You can't ask people to stop their only means of survival for a moral cause. You got to give them a way to continue on and support their families if you're going to ask them to change their morality. All right, so that was Livingstone. And it's interesting because at the time that he was going into Africa, it was called the Dark Continent, I think. And a lot of people get that confused. It's not dark because of the color of the skin of the people in Africa. It was dark. It was called dark at the time because that word meant, in this culture, unknown. It would be just like having all the lights off in this room and somebody saying, all right, go in there and figure it out. Well, it's a dark room. And so you enter it and you're like, okay, what do? I don't know where I am or what to do or what I'm going to run into. So that's why it was called the Dark Continent. So if you happen to read up on it, it is the unknown, has nothing to do with the culture or the ethnicity. All right. So does everybody have everything off this board? Can I erase it? Okay. All right, we're going to spend the next few minutes talking about, you say yes? Okay. We're going to talk about the Second Great Awakening. Okay? The Second Great Awakening, it was kind of a short, I think it was 40, it was about 40 years. And the Second Great Awakening was very interesting. It was taking place in the colonies, and some things that came from that are still pretty apparent to even what we do today. All right. So the Second Great Awakening. It took place from about 1790 to about 1830. 1830. So it began around 1790, about 15 years, this was about 15 years after, making sure I have this right, 15 years after the U.S. had become a nation, okay? So the Revolutionary War happened between 1775 and 1783. Wow, can't read that at all, sorry. And so right in the midst of that, the Great Awakening was happening. So it is a religious revival where the people who settled in the East began to travel westward, taking the gospel with them and speaking to whoever it is that they find. And it would be the natives that they would run into. They began to spread out. They began to colonize on some level, but these were at the time of the Second Great Awakening. It wasn't, let's go out and build a city here. They were just traveling out to try to find some place to homestead. But remember, these guys were living in tents, living in wagons, so they were definitely, their primary mission was to spread the gospel, because they may come out, they may find a homestead, but they may not, they may go back home. But they're definitely bringing the gospel and taking it eastward. Now, the religious viewpoint up to this time, if you remember how we went through the Quakers and the Congregationalists and the Separatists and all the people, most of those groups were most influenced by Calvin, right? This idea of predestination sort of permeated through those groups. And so it's interesting, because if you follow the idea of predestination, the idea of going out and spreading the gospel it seems sort of pointless. Because if you believe that God is going to choose who he's going to choose regardless of what we do or what we say, then going out to evangelize will make no difference either way. So the heavily Calvinistic influence was not something that pushed this westward movement of the gospel. It was the Armenian side. So like when you think about the Methodists, how they had their two doctrines, the Armenian side of the people who landed in the colonies, they were the ones who were saying, no, there's not this predestination thing. We were given the Great Commission. We were told to go out and spread the gospel and tell people about Jesus, and we need to do that. So it was really the Armenian side of those colonists that drove this evangelical movement. All right. The main characteristic of the Second Great Awakening is emotion. It's very interesting. Emotion. Post-war, there were a lot of things that needed to be dealt with. We're talking about a society of people who had left their home, mostly for persecution, so they would have religious freedom, but they had left their home and then entered into a civil war. And post-war, and even sometimes overlapping with the end of the war, but post-war, you have, these are in general a psychologically damaged people. They are pushed out and forgotten. They're strong and they're independent. They're fighting amongst one another, which means, to the point of war, which means their ideals are strong enough that they're willing to kill each other for them. And so in the aftermath of all of the things that have happened to bring the people to where they are now, there was a lot of emotion built up behind the reasons that people were doing things, and a lot of emotion built into, for example, accepting the gospel, right? So at this time, we've talked about it with a couple of the people that we were talking about from England, the slave trade, the idea that slaves were being traded back and forth, and that was part of that was the Civil War issue. There was lots of fighting about trying to get rid of the slave trade. There was also the movement to allow everyone to vote, right? Not like, can slaves vote or can they not vote? Can women vote or can they not vote? How old do you have to be able to vote? All of these questions were starting to come up in this newly independent nation. And so different groups of people were coming together and saying, we need to abolish slavery. And then if there is an attitude of Christian or religion or Jesus that's thrown into that, if you are a true Christian, why would you buy and sell people? That is not something that Jesus did, right? If you are a true Christian, why wouldn't you allow the opinion of the people and not just the opinion of the wealthy or the privileged, right? Or why is the opinion of a woman less than the opinion of a man? Alcohol was an issue. There was a whole movement. The suffrage movement was happening at the time, where people were saying we need to either moderate or we need to abolish alcohol because it's causing problems. Like, people are getting crazy. If you're a Christian, should you be drinking at all? If you are, can you drink in moderation? Like, all these things were coming up, and the doctrines of the churches and the people who were trying to lead the people, you got to take a stand. It's not like being here where you have a million different groups that you can choose from. It's a brand new thing, and they're establishing, and they're trying to figure out who they are, what they're going to teach, and the kind of people they're going to be. And so there was a lot of emotion that went into Christianity, period. And the idea that what started happening here, so remember when we were talking earlier, you help people to help people. You don't help people because they're, in order for them to listen to you. It didn't go back to that, but there was a new sort of twist on it, or just a different angle on it. And what was happening was, instead of the gospel itself being the primary message at whatever meeting that you were going to, it was the help you can provide. So it was sort of like the flip side of the I'll help you if you listen to me. What it really was is, we're going to help all you people, and the help is what we're going to put all of our money into, and all of our prayer into, and all of our energy into. But what they ended up doing, unfortunately, is not having Jesus anymore. It all became about the help. And again, the emotion that's behind the help became very, very big. It was just there. The evils of society started taking precedence over the spreading of the gospel. That's basically it. The evils of society, and there were lots of them. We talked about 2 or 3 of them, 4 of them, whatever. The evils of society became more important. And I don't mean like people would say, oh yeah, Jesus isn't important. I'm saying all of the energy and the money and the time went into it. Where your heart is, right? This is where the heart was, became more important than the gospel. Okay? Or more important than the spreading, I should say, of the gospel. Okay? So, there was a man, I may have put it down. No. There was a man named James McGreedy. Very important to the Second Great Awakening. Let me spell his name right. How much time do I have? All right, James McGreedy. This man was a Presbyterian minister. He was actually born in the colonies. He was born in Pennsylvania. And he was basically a good old boy. He was somebody that was easy to talk to. He was somebody who had a lot of compassion and a lot of understanding. He was a smart man. He was very much in love with Jesus. And God actually took all of these qualities that this man had, and he gave him an opportunity to spread the gospel in a new and very unique way. And it was very successful. What he would do, so he began to speak. He began to, kind of like what Whitefield would do, he began to go out into the city or into the town, and he would go to other towns, and then he would go to the outskirts, and then he started just going out, and all he was doing was standing on a tree stump or whatever and talking about Jesus to whoever would care to listen to him. And he became very well known. And he became what is known as, now what we would call him, is a circuit preacher. I'm sorry I'm writing so fast, it's not very legible. A circuit preacher. And he began to make rounds around these areas. And so it was almost like a tour. It was, it's like the first Christian tour or something. He would make plans and say, okay, I'm going to start in this town and I'm going to stay there for 4 days. And then I'm going to move to this town and I'm going to stay there for a week. And then I'm going to move to this town. So he kind of had an itinerary. And people, as this would spread, like as his popularity spread, people would say, oh, James McGready is going to be in the town that's 10 miles away in 2 weeks. I've got to go see McGready. I want to go listen to him preach. So he would pack up his whole family, tell everybody he knows. They would all pack up their families. And a week later, they would start heading out, or maybe a week and a half, start heading out, travel their 15 miles, and they'd set up camp. They'd take their tents or their carriages or whatever they had, and they would set up camp in the area where they knew that he would be. And they would just camp out. And they'd wait for him to show up, and then they'd stay for the whole meeting, 4 days, the week, the 2 days, whatever it was, stay for the whole meeting, and then they would just be so excited, and then they'd go back home. Or maybe they would follow him to the next town. Who knows? I mean, they would just do. But some people would travel short distances. Other people would travel miles and miles and miles and miles to be able to hear him. And he has been known to preach to upwards of 20,000 people at a time. That's amazing for being like, I'm gonna head outside of town and stand on a tree stump, and I'm gonna tell you guys about Jesus, and people just flocking in wanting to hear about him. As they started getting bigger, and as he started having converts, he was, for lack of a better term, I don't know what the term would be at this time, but he was ordaining Presbyterian ministers. And so with these big, huge camp meetings, he would be, it's almost like it reminds me of going to a concert where you have a bunch of, you have 2 or 3 different stages where all of them are playing at once, but the main stage is where you want to be. But they have, people are cooking over here and people are washing clothes over here, and it's a big community. And he would have some of his ordained ministers spread out, because you can't, he can't get his voice across, a huge distance. So he would have his people set up all over the place, and they're all standing on their rocks and their whatevers, and they're all preaching the gospel to these people. And the people are eating it up. It's highly charged, it's highly emotional, and it's highly successful. And he is, and because of all of this, let's see. Oh no, I want to tell you this first. Okay, so at the meeting that had 20,000 people, there was a witness that wrote about it, and I don't know what I think it's one of the ministers. I don't think it was just a random person. I think it was one of the people that was traveling with him. He said the noise was like the roar of Niagara. So it was super loud, all those people talking and whatever. The vast sea of human beings seemed to be agitated as by a storm. I counted 7 ministers, all preaching at one time, some on stumps, others on wagons. Some of the people were singing, others were praying, some were crying out for mercy. A particularly strange sensation came over me. My heart beat tumultuously, my knees trembled, my lips quivered, and I felt as though I must fall to the ground. That's the end of his quote. That man came to Christ during that meeting and later became a Methodist minister. Oh, I did have what it was. He wasn't a minister yet. Many of the evangelical ministers that were following James McGready or using his techniques, many of them were they created highly emotionally charged environments. And because of that, that's part of the reason that the people kept coming back and saying, oh, he's going to be 40 miles from here. I've got to go see him again. People were, and because of the success, it's my personal opinion that it's the Holy Spirit moving through that. That wasn't just emotion for the sake of emotion. It was the Holy Spirit touching people, and people were hungry and they were excited and they just kept going.
You said he became a Methodist minister?
Did I say Methodist? Presbyterian is what I meant.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry if I said, I didn't mean Methodist. I'm sorry. Yeah, everybody that was with him, they pretty much became, that's what he taught and that's what they became. Yeah. I'm sorry, I misspoke. Thank you for correcting me.
I'm listening, see?
I know, especially for the people who are out there. They're happy that someone's listening. I'm apparently not listening to me. All right. There was another man named Charles Finney. He had this is a short story, and then we're going to wrap up. Charles Finney. He is a father. He is known as the father of modern revivalism. Okay, now, the reason he's called this, it's interesting. He was living in a district of New York, and he was just spreading the gospel all through this district, and the people that were there were accepting Christ, born again, on fire, spreading the gospel, living amongst themselves, being on fire. I mean, it was just an interesting area to live in. And somebody came in, and I think I have, her name is Linda Pritchard. You can actually look this up. I mean, if you're interested, you can look it up. Linda, I'll spell it, P-R-I-T. Okay, Linda Pritchard. She did some statistics. Just, going in, what's going on in this area, what's happening, just curious, and just gathered some statistics about the area. This area, just so you, and this will help you narrow it down, this area was in New York, and it was known as the Burned Over District. That's what people called it. Kind of like you'd say, oh, that's the Northeast Heights, or that's this or that. This is the burned over district. The reason it was called that was because it was described as the gospel had gone through this area so fast and so intensely that it had burned through it. And according to this woman who was doing these statistics, she said that at this time, there were more born-again people in this area than there were unbelievers. And so being an unbeliever was an exception in this area, which is just, even now is a little bit crazy to hear about. So this father of modern revivalism, he was a revivalist for sure. He took the gospel message out, and the people that he touched, they accepted, and they were revived, and it just spread. And so throughout this area, this burned over district, it was a total revival, and he was the author. Well,
Is that Linda Pritchard?
yeah, Pritchard.
But it's
She's
Linda.
She's the statistician that came in and was asking questions and what's going on in here and what are you guys doing and what's the hype, what's happening in here. And from her interviewing and the stats that she gathered, she's the one who said that the unbeliever is the exception, that this area has gone through a massive revival. At this time, all of these denominations in the colonies now, all of these denominations were beginning to form. When the colonies first started, the majority were the Anglicans and the Quakers and the Congregationalists. They were sort of, that's who came over from England, so that was the dominant parties or denominations, if you want to call that, in the East. After the Revolutionary War and the effects of James McGready and Charles Finney and other people like him, and this Second Great Awakening, in the aftermath of all of that, it was the Methodists and the Baptists and the Presbyterians that came up, and those denominations became their numbers began to grow. The Church of Christ was formed at the time of the Second Great Awakening. The Seventh-day Adventist Church was formed during this time. What we now call the evangelical Christian churches, those were formed at this time. After the Revolutionary War, I've said this before, but I didn't give you so you know how the Greek Orthodoxy Church, or the became that after 1054 with the split, like that became a branch. And then after King Henry VIII, the Church of England began to exist separately from the Church at Rome, right? So these big splits. At this time, Now I forgot what I was going to tell you. I had it. I'm sorry. At this time, it was the Anglicans. So after the Revolutionary War, this is when the Anglican Church, and remember, that's just another way of saying the Church of England, they began to be known as Episcopalians. Episcopalians. So they're really the same group of people. There was some change in doctrine, but not really. It's kind of like at Rome, Church of England, just a slight change. Anglican Church began to be known as Episcopalian, and they're certainly alive and well today. If you ask somebody about Episcopalians, I would say that you have a 50-50 shot of that person saying that their roots are in the Church of Rome, because they're considered Catholic, right? They're just called Catholic, like universal. But really their roots are out of the Church of England, which are out of the Church of Rome. So their government style is different, but their doctrine is very similar, right? All right. So the other interesting thing, just like 2 more minutes, the other interesting thing is after the time of the Revolutionary War, all of these people were coming to Christ in a 2-to-1 ratio. It was men to women. So women were coming to Christ in double the numbers that men were coming to Christ. And it kind of makes sense. I mean, I don't mean to stereotype us, although I guess maybe I can get away with it since I am a girl. But the emotional state, women are very sensitive. They're emotional just by nature, and they respond. And if it's an emotional issue, women are more likely to respond than men are. But plenty of men responded. It's just that women responded more quickly. And it's just interesting that there became an imbalance in the church. And remember we were talking, or if you've studied Acts, you had to have 10 Jewish men in order to have a synagogue or a temple, right? And there were times whenever they would enter the city and there weren't even 10 Jewish men. And so then they would immediately go to the river and they would expect the less than 10 men, the 9 or less men, to be at the river teaching. If there were no men, you would find the women there. So it's interesting that that idea carries on, even though it's not necessarily emotional then, but women are just, in general, can be very sensitive, and they don't really care. They just show up even if no one else is going to be there. It still happens today. So, many congregations will be heavily more women than men. It just seems to be that's the way it is, which is partly the reason that I keep going back to it's just the nature of women to be more sensitive. Not weak and not whatever, just more sensitive to the Spirit. So all of this stuff that I've told you, the Second Great Awakening, all of these denominations are now starting to pop out. And can you imagine how the Church at Rome and the Church in England, as they are hearing about this, can you imagine how they are reacting to what they are finding out about what's going on in the colonies? We're talking about I think I have the statistics here. At this time, Catholicism was 1,600 years old, which means that the Church of Rome was 1,600 years old, and the Church of England, right? The Eastern Orthodoxy Church is about 1,000 years old. Lutheranism and Roman Catholicism, after the split, are about 450 years old. Evangelicalism is about 150 years old. Fundamentalism is about 100 years old, which we didn't talk about. I'll hit that next time. And so as the Protestant churches continued to make all of these branches out, they started to lose a little bit of their identity. Remember when they came over, they were heavily Calvinistic, and then they started going a little bit more Armenian, and then, because Armenians are more likely to spread, and that's the evangelicals and blah, blah, blah. Well, they still, and this is not watered, I'm going to use the term watered down, but it's not meant to be a negative thing. I'm just saying that instead of the staunch, this is the way we believe, they started being a little Calvin, a little Armenian, maybe a little bit Quakerish, maybe a little bit Presbyterian. And, so things started happening. And as people began to form, I don't know if you guys have heard this, but Pastor Kahn has talked about the gray areas that are Scripture. Like there are certain things in Scripture where you're told, you can do this, you cannot do that. And then there are other things in Scripture like eating meat sacrificed to idols, right? That's a gray area in Scripture because there's no power behind the idol, so there's nothing wrong with eating it. But if the person that you go to church with is hung up on it because they're coming out of idolatry or whatever, or if they grew up in a tradition, they're traditionally just against because there is power, whatever. If you choose to eat that in front of them, you may cause them to stumble. Don't do that. Like it's a gray area. You have the freedom to do it through Christ, but don't do that to them. Like if you're going out with your person who is in AA, don't get a beer. Like, don't do that to them, right? So these gray areas where it's not saying you cannot do this, you're going against the will of God, but should you or shouldn't you? That's where these denominations largely, for a very generalized way of saying it, these denominations, that's how they're formed. The doctrine stays the same. You must be born again. Jesus has to be the center. All these things are there, but we want to govern this a little differently. We want to be more focused on foreign missions. We want, you know what I mean? So it's not that the doctrine is different, but the important things or what they want to focus on begins to splinter. And then all of these denominations come out of it, right? And they have their forefathers like John Wesley and Martin Luther and all these people that we've been discussing through the Reformation, fundamentally, well, Calvin is a little bit less fundamental because of his predestination thing, but in general, fundamentally, all those founders had the same idea. They all had the same doctrine, the same idea, and it was all centered around being born again and spreading the gospel. And then all these other things happened that came in sort of the gray areas, so to speak, for just as a comparison, and all these denominations began to happen. And because those people came from England, they set it up such that religious freedom trumps everything. You can be whatever religion you want. You can practice it when you want. You can do whatever you want because we will never be persecuted. I said it right that time. Never be persecuted for our religion like our ancestors were under, the different kings and whatever, right? So getting back to what I started with a minute ago, all these denominations are just starting to splinter off, right? Well, I'm going to be part of this. I'm going to be part of that, right? Can you imagine how the church at Rome and the church in England are looking over at the colonies, finding out about, now there's a new denomination. They're called whatever. Now there's a new denomination. They're called whatever, And they're going, oh my gosh, they have gone completely insane. Because they didn't stick to tradition and because they weren't firm, their foundation was broken when they left the church, this is what happens. It's just dispersion, and there's all of this, I'm sure to them, chaos going on in the colonies. So the denominations, while they definitely serve a purpose, and they're almost a knee-jerk reaction to the Constitution that was developed. You can have the religion that you want in this country. Religious persecution is against the Constitution in this country. That's just the bottom line. It was founded on that. So all of these things are happening in accordance with the Constitution, but Christianity in general, like if you look at Christianity as a whole, it's beginning to be weakened. Because you can't have, if you have one solid steel ball, that does a particular kind of damage. But if you splinter that steel ball, it doesn't even have to be into 1 million pieces, it can be into 20 pieces. None of those pieces have the strength or the power or the impact that the one ball had when it was all together. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's not, so the denominations are coming naturally out of the absolute law or attitude that we will not persecute anyone for their religion. But the backlash from that is that Christianity in general ended up being weakened because you have all of these branches coming off where in and of themselves they are, they're fragile. And then as time goes on, because we're human and this was inevitable, they begin to fight with each other. They begin to tear each other down instead of supporting each other and forgetting about the gray area and focusing on the doctrine. It becomes I am a Lutheran. And then that's all you have to say, because the audience that hears you is like, oh, okay, whatever. I am a Roman Catholic. I am an Episcopalian. Do you know what I mean? It's almost like a nationalism issue. We are so focused on what we are. We've done what our colony founders did and focused so much on what we need to fix that we forgot about the fixer. So Christianity in general, because of the denominations, has become weak. Not necessarily watered down, not necessarily weak in doctrine, but because we are not unified the way we could be. Christianity in general, because of denominations, is weak. Does that make sense? All right. That's it. I kept you guys 15 extra minutes. I'm sorry, but I think I caught us up, and I don't have to. I won't have to do anything next week to catch us up.